Garbage like you doesn't belong in a courthouse. It belongs in a cage. Those words, spat with the venom of a man who believed himself a god, would echo in the chambers of Officer Frank Miller's mind for the rest of his miserable life. He just didn't know it yet. Judge Evelyn Reed approached the Harrison County Courthouse steps, the morning sun glinting off the polished leather of her briefcase. Dressed in a simple but elegant pantsuit, she looked like any other successful professional on her way to work. In her mind, she was already running through the docket for the day: a complex fraud case, a sentencing hearing, and a motion to suppress evidence. It was just another Tuesday. But for Officer Miller, standing guard at the entrance, she was just another problem. He saw a black woman in a place he felt she didn't belong, and his world, built on a fragile foundation of prejudice and unearned authority, narrowed to a single, ugly point of focus. "Another piece of ghetto trash trying to sneak past security," he muttered to his partner, Officer Jennings, who snickered in response. Miller puffed out his chest, a caricature of law enforcement, and stepped directly into her path. His shadow fell over her, a physical manifestation of his contempt. "Hold it right there. Where do you think you're going?" Evelyn stopped, a flicker of surprise in her eyes, but her expression remained neutral. "Good morning, officer. I'm heading into work." "Work?" Miller sneered, his gaze raking over her attire with disdain. "The janitorial staff uses the service entrance around back." Evelyn's composure didn't crack. "I assure you, I'm not on the janitorial staff. Now, if you'll excuse me." She made to step around him, but Miller moved to block her again, his body language escalating from obstruction to overt aggression. "I don't think so. I need to see some ID. And I need to know what's in that briefcase, probably full of stolen goods." This was the moment. The moment where a routine day curdled into a nightmare. Evelyn could have pulled out her judicial credentials then and there. She could have ended it with a single flash of her ID. But something held her back. It was the casual, unthinking poison in his tone, the smug certainty in his eyes. She had seen this man before, not him specifically, but his type. She'd seen them in police reports, read their names in civil rights complaints, and sentenced men for crimes that began with officers just like this one. A cold, analytical part of her brain took over. She decided to let him play out his hand. "Officer, I'm late for a 9 a.m. proceeding. I'm happy to show you my identification inside at the security checkpoint, just like everyone else." "You see, that's the problem," Miller said, leaning in so close she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "You're not like everyone else. You think the rules don't apply to you." He jabbed a thick finger towards her chest. "But I'm the rules here." And then he crossed a line from which there was no return. His open palm cracked against her face. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet morning air. The force of the blow was so shocking, so unexpected that her head snapped sideways, her sunglasses flying off her face and skittering across the pavement. The expensive leather briefcase, filled with sensitive legal documents, tumbled from her grasp. Its clasps burst open on impact, and a blizzard of papers, motions, briefs, judicial orders, scattered like fallen leaves across the courthouse steps. Before she could even register the pain blooming across her cheek, Miller grabbed her. His fingers dug into the soft flesh of her throat, and he slammed her backward against the cold, unyielding stone of the courthouse wall. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs. "Garbage like you doesn't belong in a courthouse," he snarled, his face inches from hers, his eyes burning with a hateful fire. "It belongs in a cage." He twisted her arms behind her back with brutal efficiency, the metallic rasp of handcuffs echoing in the morning air. The cold steel bit into her wrists, cinched so tight it felt like her bones were grinding together. Other officers, including his partner Jennings, and another named Riley, had gathered around. They weren't intervening. They were laughing. A few of them had their phones out, recording the humiliation, creating a digital trophy of their dominance. A throbbing, white-hot pain pulsed from her jaw, and she could taste the coppery tang of blood in her mouth. But through the haze of shock and pain, her eyes remained fixed, locked onto the large bronze nameplate mounted above the grand entrance of the building. It read, "The Honorable Judge Evelyn Reed, presiding." She was less than 50 feet from her own courtroom, being brutalized, humiliated, and illegally arrested by the very system she had sworn an oath to uphold. Miller had no idea. He was just a wolf who had cornered what he thought was a sheep. He was about to find out he'd cornered a tiger. He had just assaulted the one person in the entire county who had the power to burn his entire world to the ground. Inside the sterile, air-conditioned chill of the courthouse, Officer Miller straightened his uniform, a smug smile playing on his lips. He ran a hand through his short, cropped hair and cleared his throat. He had performed this song and dance countless times. It was a well-rehearsed play. Spin the story, control the narrative, paint himself as the hero who had narrowly averted a crisis. The system was predictable. The system always believed a cop in a crisp uniform over a person of color with a fresh bruise, especially when that person looked like her. He stood before the temporary judge, a man named Harrison, a pale, frail-looking man in his late 60s who seemed more interested in his lunch than in the proceedings. Evelyn sat at the defendant's table, the cold metal of the handcuffs a constant, humiliating reminder of the last hour. A deep purple bruise was already blooming across her left cheek, a stark testament to Miller's professionalism. "Your Honor," Miller began, his voice a perfect blend of confidence and weary duty. It was a voice practiced in the art of deception, honed over years of telling similar stories. "I was conducting routine security protocols at the main entrance when I encountered a suspicious individual attempting to breach courthouse security." He gestured dramatically toward Evelyn, as if presenting a dangerous wild animal he had single-handedly subdued. "The defendant, Your Honor, was acting erratically. She was dressed inappropriately for court proceedings and refused to provide any form of identification. She became increasingly agitated and belligerent when I asked her to comply with standard security procedures." Judge Harrison, peering over his reading glasses, nodded with a distinct air of approval. "And what precisely did you observe that made her suspicious, Officer Miller?" "Well, sir," Miller said, his eyes gleaming as he warmed to his fabrication, "she was carrying what appeared to be stolen legal documents, very sensitive materials." He let that hang in the air, allowing the judge's imagination to fill in the nefarious details. "When I approached to investigate, she immediately became verbally aggressive. The profanity she used, Your Honor, it was shocking. She made direct threats against my person and against the safety of this courthouse." From the gallery, his partners, Jennings and Riley, exchanged subtle, knowing looks. They were the chorus to his lead performance. They had seen the script play out dozens of times before. Different day, different face, same predictable story. "She kept screaming about being someone important," Miller continued, his voice now dripping with a theatrical disdain. "These people, they always do that. They claim to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to try and intimidate law enforcement and avoid accountability for their actions. I've seen this playbook before, Your Honor. It's a classic." Judge Harrison leaned forward, his interest finally piqued. "Did she attempt to flee or resist arrest in any way?" "Absolutely," Miller lied without a flicker of hesitation. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, it felt more natural to him than the truth. "The defendant became physically combative when I attempted to place her in protective custody. I was, regretfully, forced to use the minimum necessary force to ensure public safety and the security of this building." As he spoke, his hand trembled, an almost imperceptible tremor, the only crack in his otherwise polished performance. The court stenographer's fingers flew across her machine, her face a mask of professional neutrality, capturing every syllable of his elaborate fiction for posterity. In the back row, a young law clerk, a recent graduate named Sarah, frowned. Something was nagging at her, a strange feeling of familiarity as she looked at the bruised but composed woman at the defendant's table. The prosecutor, a middle-aged woman named Sandra Walsh, who had a reputation for always siding with the police, rose to her feet. "Officer Jennings," she called out, "can you corroborate Officer Miller's testimony?" Jennings stood, his uniform pressed to military perfection. "Yes, ma'am. I witnessed the entire incident. The defendant was clearly attempting to circumvent our security protocols. Officer Miller handled the situation with remarkable professionalism and restraint." "And the alleged assault?" Judge Harrison inquired, his tone making it clear he didn't believe there was anything alleged about it. Miller's jaw tightened. "Your Honor, I used only the force necessary to subdue an aggressive and non-compliant individual who posed a clear and present threat. The defendant's injuries, if any, are a direct result of her own violent resistance to lawful commands." He pulled out his personal cell phone, swiping to a video. "I have partial footage here, Your Honor. Unfortunately, my body cam malfunctioned this morning. A technical glitch." The lie rolled off his tongue like honey. A convenient glitch that just happened to erase the beginning of the confrontation. "How convenient," Evelyn murmured, speaking for the first time. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room's stale air like a razor. "I'm sorry?" Judge Harrison raised a thin eyebrow. "Did you say something?" "Nothing, Your Honor," she replied, her voice now a model of calm deference. But her eyes, fixed on Miller, blazed with a controlled fury that could have melted steel. Miller, emboldened, pressed his advantage. "What we're seeing here, Your Honor, is a classic case of someone playing the victim card after being caught red-handed. She was trespassing on government property, carrying suspicious documents that were likely stolen, and when she was confronted with her criminal behavior, she immediately tried to make it about race." The prosecutor, Sandra Walsh, nodded sympathetically. "Officer Miller, in your 15 years of decorated service, have you encountered similar situations?" "Unfortunately, yes. Far too often," Miller said, his voice rising with righteous indignation. "There's a pattern here. Certain individuals believe they're above the law, that the rules simply don't apply to them. They use baseless accusations of racism as a shield to deflect from their own criminal behavior. Honestly, Your Honor, it's insulting to the real victims of discrimination." Several people in the gallery, mostly white courthouse employees, nodded in solemn agreement. They had heard these stories on the news. They had seen these narratives play out on social media. It felt familiar. It felt comfortable. It confirmed what they already believed. "The defendant claims she was going to work," Miller said, making mocking air quotes with his fingers, "but she couldn't provide any employment verification, any identification, or any legitimate reason for being in a restricted area of the courthouse." Riley, the third officer, stepped forward, eager to add his own brushstroke to the masterpiece of lies. "If I may add, Your Honor, the defendant was carrying what appeared to be highly confidential legal documents. We suspect she may have been involved in some kind of identity theft or fraud scheme." Judge Harrison looked genuinely intrigued now. "A fraud scheme, you say?" "Yes, sir." Miller jumped back in, sensing the momentum was entirely in his favor. "These documents had judicial letterhead, case numbers, sensitive information. No legitimate citizen would have access to materials like this. We believe she may have been planning to impersonate court personnel to gain access to sensitive areas." The irony was so thick it was nearly suffocating. He was accusing a judge of impersonating court personnel in her own courthouse. But Miller, blinded by his arrogance, was oblivious to the elaborate trap he was setting for himself. "In my professional opinion," he concluded, puffing out his chest one final time. "This is simply another case of someone trying to game the system. She knows if she can make this about race, about alleged police brutality, she can distract the court from her actual crimes. It's a calculated manipulation of public sympathy." He turned to face Evelyn directly, his eyes cold and contemptuous. "These people think they can just waltz into any building, any courtroom, any space they choose. And when they're stopped and held accountable, they scream discrimination. Well, not today. Not in my courthouse." The words hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. "Your Honor," Prosecutor Walsh added smoothly, "the state recommends we proceed with charges of trespassing, resisting arrest, and assault on a police officer. The defendant's transparent attempt to frame this as a civil rights issue is clearly a desperate and meritless defense strategy." Miller allowed himself a small, tight smile. This was going perfectly, exactly as planned. Another case closed, another win for the good guys, another reminder that the system worked just the way it was supposed to. People either knew their place or they were taught it the hard way. "Furthermore," he continued, feeling invincible, "I want to emphasize for the record that I showed remarkable restraint. The defendant was clearly unstable, possibly under the influence of narcotics. A lesser officer might have used much more significant force to neutralize the threat." Judge Harrison nodded gravely. "Your professionalism is noted for the record, Officer Miller." In the defendant's chair, Evelyn sat perfectly still. Her hands, still cuffed, were folded in her lap. Her expression remained preternaturally calm, almost serene. But if anyone had looked closely, they would have noticed the slight, almost imperceptible upturn at the corners of her mouth. She wasn't just listening. She was memorizing. She was taking meticulous mental notes of every lie, every fabrication, every single detail that would soon be used to unravel Miller's career, his reputation, and his freedom. The officer had absolutely no idea he was testifying under oath in front of the one person who held the power to utterly destroy him. "Is there anything else you'd like to add, officer?" Judge Harrison asked, clearly ready to wrap things up. Miller straightened his shoulders, standing tall. "Just that incidents like this remind us all why we need strong law enforcement. Some people only understand authority when it's backed by force. The defendant learned a valuable lesson today. Actions have consequences." He had no idea how prophetic those words would be. The prosecutor smiled confidently. "The state rests its case against this defendant, Your Honor. The evidence clearly shows a pattern of criminal behavior and a dangerous resistance to lawful authority." As Miller stepped down from the witness stand, he caught Evelyn's eye one final time. He gave her a smug, subtle wink. It was a gesture of complete dominance, of total victory. It would be the last moment of triumph in his entire life. "The defendant may now present her statement," Judge Harrison announced, his tone heavy with condescension, suggesting this was a mere formality before he handed down her sentence. The trap was set. The lies had been told under oath. What do you think is about to happen? Drop your predictions in the comments below. And if you're finding this story as intense as I am, do me a favor and smash that like button. It really helps the channel, and trust me, the payoff is coming. Evelyn Reed rose slowly from her chair. The soft clinking of the handcuffs was the only sound in the suddenly silent courtroom. Despite the angry purple bruise on her cheek and the disheveled state of her clothes, she carried herself with an unmistakable, innate dignity that made several people in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats. Something was off. This didn't feel like a typical defendant. "Thank you, Your Honor," she began. Her voice was not the hysterical, emotional outburst everyone expected. It was clear, controlled, and resonated with an authority that seemed to physically expand and fill the entire room. "I appreciate the opportunity to address these allegations." Judge Harrison blinked, taken aback. Something in her tone, her cadence, was utterly unexpected. It was professional in a way that didn't remotely match the narrative of the ghetto rat he had just been presented. "First," Evelyn said, her eyes sweeping methodically across the courtroom, landing for a moment on each person who had supported Miller's lies. "I want to clarify several glaring factual inaccuracies in Officer Miller's sworn testimony." The prosecutor, Sandra Walsh, frowned, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "According to his statement," Evelyn continued, her voice as sharp and precise as a scalpel, "I was trespassing on government property. However, I was walking on a public sidewalk, approaching the main entrance of this courthouse at approximately 8:47 a.m. She turned slightly, addressing Judge Harrison directly, as a peer would. "Your Honor, I am certain you are familiar with the Supreme Court ruling in Hague versus the Committee for Industrial Organization, which clearly establishes that public sidewalks adjacent to government buildings are traditional public forums where all citizens have a constitutional right to be present." The stenographer's fingers paused mid-stroke. Walsh's frown deepened. This wasn't the rambling, defensive plea of a guilty person. This was the opening argument of a seasoned litigator. "Furthermore," Evelyn went on, her confidence growing with every word, "Officer Miller testified that I was carrying suspicious documents and suggested I was involved in some sort of identity theft. I'd like to examine that claim more closely." She gestured with her cuffed hands towards the evidence table, where her scattered papers had been unceremoniously dumped. Those documents are indeed authentic legal materials. Specifically, they include pending case files for Peterson versus Allied Corp., several judicial memoranda, and administrative correspondence related to the upcoming judicial conference, all of which I have legitimate, and I might add, exclusive access to in my professional capacity. "Professional capacity?" Judge Harrison interrupted, a note of irritation in his voice. "And what exactly is your profession, Ms.?" Evelyn paused, a slight, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. "It's Williams, Your Honor, Dr. Evelyn Reed Williams, and I believe we'll get to my professional background very shortly." A cold chill, like a snake of ice, slithered down Officer Miller's spine. Something was terribly, horribly wrong with this picture. "Your Honor, if I may continue," Evelyn said, her voice seamlessly taking on the familiar cadence of someone completely at home, commanding a courtroom. "Officer Miller also testified under oath that I became verbally aggressive and used profanity. I'd like to address that specific claim by invoking my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent regarding any statements I may or may not have made during the alleged incident." She let that sink in, a calculated move that sent a ripple of confusion through the room. "However," she added, "I will note for the record that any statements I did make were in direct response to being physically assaulted without provocation, without warning, and without any discernible legal justification." The young law clerk, Sarah, sat up straighter in the back row. That voice, those mannerisms. She knew them. "Now, regarding the officer's convenient claim that his body camera malfunctioned," Evelyn continued, and now there was steel in her voice. "Your Honor, I'm sure you are aware of the federal rules of evidence, particularly Rule 106, the rule of completeness. I have reason to believe that comprehensive, unedited video and audio evidence of this morning's entire incident exists and can be made readily available to this court." Judge Harrison leaned forward, his bored demeanor evaporating. "What kind of evidence are you referring to?" "Your Honor, this courthouse has an extensive security camera network, including high-definition cameras positioned at 15-foot intervals along the entire main approach. Additionally, Harrison County maintains an automatic tamper-proof cloud backup system for all officer body cam footage, a system that uploads data in 60-second intervals, regardless of any claimed equipment malfunctions on the device itself. The color drained from Frank Miller's face. In his haste to control the narrative, in his arrogant certainty, he had completely forgotten about the courthouse's own security cameras. "I would like to formally request," Evelyn stated, her voice ringing with newfound power, "that this court issue an immediate preservation order for all electronic surveillance data from this morning between the hours of 8:45 a.m. and 9:15 a.m. This order should include, but not be limited to, all courthouse security footage from cameras 1 through 7, all body cam backup files from Officers Miller, Jennings, and Riley, and any and all mobile phone recordings that may have been made by the officers present at the scene." Prosecutor Walsh leaped to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant cannot simply make broad evidentiary demands without proper legal representation." Evelyn turned to face the prosecutor. The look in her eyes was so cold, so commanding, that Walsh took an involuntary step backward. "Your Honor, Pro Se defendants have the constitutional right to present evidence in their own defense under the Sixth Amendment. Additionally, Brady v. Maryland establishes the prosecution's absolute obligation to preserve and turn over all potentially exculpatory evidence. I'm surprised Ms. Walsh needs a reminder." The silence in the courtroom was now deafening. This was not how these cases were supposed to go. This was a stunning, unprecedented reversal. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, his face a mixture of confusion and dawning apprehension. "Ms. Williams, you seem unusually familiar with legal procedure. Do you have formal legal training?" "I have some experience with the judicial system, Your Honor," Evelyn replied, her answer a masterful understatement. Her eyes gleamed with something that looked terrifyingly like amusement. She walked, as much as the handcuffs would allow, toward the evidence table and gestured toward her scattered belongings. "Your Honor, I would also like to address Officer Miller's characterization of my presence here as suspicious or unauthorized." She pointed to a specific document among the papers, a neatly printed schedule. "This is my daily court calendar. It clearly shows I was scheduled to preside over— I was scheduled to appear in this building for legitimate business starting at 9 a.m. sharp this morning. The bailiff, a large, stoic man named Henderson who had worked in this courthouse for 20 years, suddenly went very still. He had been standing by the door, observing the proceedings with mild interest. Now he was staring at Evelyn, his eyes wide with a look of dawning recognition and absolute horror. "Officer Miller testified that I claimed to be someone important," Evelyn continued, her voice steady. "I would like to clarify for the record that I never made any such claim. However, I did attempt to show him my identification, which he refused to even look at before initiating his unprovoked assault." She paused, letting her gaze sweep over the stunned faces in the courtroom. "Your Honor, I have in my possession, despite Officer Miller's violent and unlawful interference, documentation that will conclusively establish both my identity and my legitimate, legally mandated reason for being at this courthouse this morning." Judge Harrison was now beginning to look distinctly ill. "What kind of documentation?" Evelyn reached carefully into her jacket pocket, moving slowly and deliberately. She pulled out several items and placed them on the edge of the defendant's table. "My judicial parking pass, issued by this courthouse's administrative office. My building access card, programmed with entry codes for judicial chambers and secure corridors. And my official state-issued judicial identification." Bailiff Henderson's face went as pale as a ghost. He recognized the woman he had greeted with a respectful, "Good morning, Your Honor," every single day for the past decade. "Your Honor," Evelyn said quietly, holding up a leather credential wallet. Even from across the room, the embossed gold judicial seal was clearly horrifyingly visible. "I believe there's been a significant and potentially criminal misunderstanding about who, exactly, Officer Miller assaulted this morning." She paused, letting the full weight of her statement crush the remaining arrogance out of Frank Miller. "Perhaps," she suggested, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone who was used to giving orders in a courtroom, not taking them. "We should recess so that proper identifications can be thoroughly verified." Judge Harrison stared at the credential wallet, then at Evelyn's bruised but resolute face, then at the bailiff, who was now nodding grimly, his expression a mixture of terror and apology. Court will recess for 15 minutes, Harrison stammered, his voice hoarse. As the gavel fell with a weak, uncertain tap, Frank Miller felt the solid floor beneath him give way. His world was not just crumbling, it was collapsing into a black hole of his own making. Whatever sick, twisted game he thought he was playing, he was just now beginning to realize that he didn't even know the rules. During the 15-minute recess, the courthouse buzzed with a frantic, nervous energy usually reserved for bomb threats. In a small holding room adjacent to the courtroom, Evelyn sat calmly while Bailiff Henderson fumbled with a set of keys, his large hands shaking so violently he could barely fit the key into the lock on her handcuffs. The reality of the situation had hit him like a physical blow. "Judge Reed," he whispered, his voice thick with horror and shame. "Jesus Christ, Judge Reed, I am so sorry. I didn't recognize you in your civilian clothes, and when they brought you in like that, It's all right, Henderson," Evelyn replied, her voice soft but firm. "You weren't a part of this, but I need you to do something for me now, and I need you to be quick and quiet about it. Anything, Your Honor. Anything at all. I need you to go to my chambers. Bring me my judicial robes, the black ones with the gold trim, and Henderson." She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze steady and intense. "Bring my gavel, too, the engraved one from my swearing-in ceremony." Henderson nodded vigorously, a man on a holy mission, and hurried out, leaving Evelyn alone with her thoughts. She closed her eyes and took a long, deep breath, centering herself, drawing on the reserves of composure she had cultivated over 3 decades in the legal profession. This morning, she had been Judge Evelyn Reed, a respected jurist, a protector of constitutional rights, a guardian of justice. In the span of a few horrifying minutes, she had been transformed into a victim, a defendant, a woman in handcuffs facing a battery of fabricated charges. But now, it was time to reclaim what was hers. Her phone, which had been confiscated during her arrest but was now back in her possession, buzzed insistently. It was a string of increasingly frantic text messages from her clerk, Janet Morrison. "Judge Reed, where are you? The Peterson hearing is in 30 minutes. Your Honor, the attorneys are here asking about delays. Should I tell them something? Judge Reed, please call me back. There are rumors flying that something happened at the entrance." Evelyn typed back a quick, decisive reply. "Tell the Peterson attorneys we'll reschedule. Something more important has come up. Clear my entire afternoon calendar." She then scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she was looking for. Chief Judge Margaret Carter, the administrative head of the entire judicial district, and a close friend. "Margaret, it's Evelyn." "Evelyn, thank God. We heard there was some kind of incident. Are you all right?" "I've been better, Margaret. I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it right now without asking any questions." "Of course, whatever you need. I need you to contact the courthouse security office and tell them to immediately preserve and copy all surveillance footage from this morning between 8:45 and 9:15 a.m., all cameras, all angles. And Margaret," Evelyn added, her voice hardening, "make sure there are multiple redundant copies stored in different secure locations." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Evelyn, what exactly happened this morning?" "A police officer named Frank Miller just spent the better part of an hour testifying under oath about how he heroically subdued a dangerous criminal who was trespassing on courthouse property," Evelyn said, her voice steady, but laced with an icy fury that Chief Judge Carter had never heard before. "And the dangerous criminal was me, Margaret, on my way to work. He didn't just arrest me. He assaulted me in front of this courthouse, called me garbage, and told me I belonged in a cage. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds, a void of pure shock. Jesus Christ, Evelyn. What do you need? Should I call the FBI? The Attorney General's office? Not yet. First, I need those surveillance recordings secured. Then I need you to start making some phone calls. I want every single case Officer Frank Miller has testified in over the past 5 years pulled and flagged for immediate review. Every single one. Consider it done, Margaret said, her voice now grim and determined. But Evelyn, you can't handle this case yourself. It's an obvious conflict of interest. Oh, I'm not going to handle it, Margaret. I'm going to end it. In about 10 minutes, I'm going to walk back into that courtroom, and I'm going to be wearing my judicial robes. Officer Miller is going to learn exactly who he assaulted this morning. And more importantly, he's going to learn who has the power to ensure he faces the full, unmitigated consequences of his actions. Just then, Henderson returned, carrying a garment bag and a small, polished wooden box. Your robes, Your Honor, and your gavel. Evelyn stood and unzipped the bag, revealing the flowing black judicial robes that had been her armor and her symbol for over 2 decades. As she slipped them on, she felt a profound transformation begin. The heavy fabric settled on her shoulders like a mantle of authority. Each familiar fold was a reminder of the power she wielded, the sacred oaths she had taken, and the justice she was sworn to protect. She opened the wooden box and lifted out her ceremonial gavel. Its weight was familiar and comforting in her hand. Engraved on its handle were the words, Justitia non novit patrem nec matrem. Solam veritatem spectat. Justice knows neither father nor mother. It beholds the truth alone. Henderson, she said, adjusting her robes, her voice now devoid of any trace of the victim she had been portrayed as. When we return to that courtroom, I want you to announce me. Properly. Yes, Your Honor. How would you like to be announced? Judge Evelyn Reed straightened to her full height, every inch the formidable federal judge she was. The bruise on her cheek was still starkly visible, but now it served a different purpose. It was no longer just evidence of Miller's brutality. It was a symbol of how far the system had fallen, and how completely it was about to be restored. The Honorable Judge Evelyn Reed, presiding. As she walked toward the door that led back into the courtroom, she felt a cold, righteous certainty settle over her. When court resumed, Officer Frank Miller would learn what justice really means. All rise. Bailiff Henderson's voice boomed through the courtroom with a thunderous authority that made every person present, including Judge Harrison, snap to attention. But what happened next was a moment that would be seared into their memories for the rest of their lives. Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Evelyn Reed, presiding. The words hit the courtroom like a physical shockwave. Officer Miller, who had been leaning casually against the prosecutor's table, whispering with Walsh, went bone-white and rigid. Judge Harrison, still seated in what he now realized with dawning horror was not his chair, looked as though he had seen a ghost. The prosecutor's mouth fell open in a silent gasp. Then Judge Evelyn Reed entered through the judge's private chamber door. She was wearing her full judicial robes, the gold trim catching the harsh overhead lights. She moved with the slow, measured, deliberate pace of someone who had walked this path thousands of times before. In her right hand, she carried her heavy ceremonial gavel. The silence in the room was absolute, a perfect vacuum where not a single person dared to breathe. She took her place behind the bench, her bench, and sat down slowly, her movements filled with purpose. Her eyes, cold and piercing, swept the courtroom, taking in every shocked face, every dropped jaw, every single person who was finally beginning to understand the cataclysmic magnitude of what had just happened. "Officer Miller," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the full, crushing weight of judicial authority. "You may remain standing." Miller looked like he was about to be physically sick. His face had cycled from red to white to a sickly shade of green in the span of 30 seconds. Your Honor," Judge Harrison stammered, scrambling to rise from the chair. We didn't. I mean to say—" "Judge Harrison," Evelyn interrupted, her tone crisp but not unkind. "Thank you for managing my courtroom during my unexpected delay. You may return to your own docket now. I'll be handling this matter from here." Harrison practically fled from the courtroom, his robes billowing behind him as if he were being chased by demons. Evelyn then turned her undivided attention back to Miller, who was now visibly shaking, his entire body trembling. "Officer Miller, approximately 2 hours ago, you testified under oath in this courtroom. Do you recall your testimony?" I... Miller couldn't form a coherent word. His mind was a maelstrom of panic and disbelief. "Let me refresh your memory," Evelyn continued, her voice dangerously calm. "You stated, and I quote, 'These people always claim to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to avoid accountability.' Do you remember saying that?" Miller managed a weak, jerky nod. "You also stated that I was, quote, 'another entitled activist looking for a payday,' and that you had seen, quote, 'this playbook before.' Is that an accurate recollection of your sworn testimony?" The courtroom was so quiet that the low hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roaring jet engine. And perhaps most memorably, Evelyn's voice grew colder, harder. "You stated that people like me need to learn that, quote, 'actions have consequences.' Do you recall dispensing that particular piece of wisdom?" Miller's legs were shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the table to remain standing. Evelyn reached under her bench and produced a tablet computer, its screen glowing. "Officer Miller, I'd like to show you some evidence that has just come to my attention." She turned the tablet's screen so it was visible to the entire courtroom. On it was crystal clear, high-definition security camera footage from the courthouse steps, showing the entire incident from multiple damning angles. "This is footage from courthouse security camera number 7, which, as you know, has an unobstructed view of the main entrance," she said, her finger touching the screen to start the video. The courtroom watched in stunned, horrified silence as the events of the morning unfolded on the screen in vivid, undeniable detail. There was Evelyn, walking calmly toward the courthouse. There was Miller, blocking her path. "Another piece of ghetto trash trying to sneak past security." Miller's own voice, clear as day, filled the courtroom through the tablet's speakers. Several people in the gallery gasped audibly. The video continued, showing Miller's unprovoked, brutal assault. The vicious slap that snapped Evelyn's head sideways, the brutal grab to her throat, the contemptuous way he scattered her legal papers, the other officers laughing and recording. But the most damning moment was yet to come. "Garbage like you doesn't belong in a courthouse. It belongs in a cage." Miller's own words, spoken with such pure, distilled venom and hatred, echoed through the very courtroom he claimed to protect. Several jurors from other cases who had been waiting in the gallery stood up and walked out in silent, unified disgust. "Officer Miller," Evelyn said, pausing the video, "do you see any verbal aggression from the defendant in this footage? Any profanity? Any threats?" Miller remained silent, his career, his life, disintegrating before his very eyes. "Now," Evelyn continued, swiping to a new video file, "let's examine your claim that your body cam malfunctioned. This, officer, is the backup footage from your own body-worn camera, automatically and wirelessly uploaded to the county's secure cloud storage system every 60 seconds, a system you apparently, and conveniently, forgot existed." The new video began to play. It was Miller's own point of view, and his voice filled the courtroom again. But this time it was even worse. This was the complete, unedited director's cut of his own downfall. "Look at this uppity bitch thinking she can just walk into my courthouse," Miller's recorded voice snarled through the speakers. "These people need to be taught their place. Time to teach another lesson in respect." The prosecutor, Sandra Walsh, was frantically and clumsily gathering her papers, trying to physically distance herself from the legal and ethical catastrophe unfolding before her. But Evelyn was not finished. Not by a long shot. "Officer Jennings, Officer Riley," she called out, her voice echoing in the silent room. "You both testified under oath that Officer Miller handled this situation with remarkable professionalism. Would either of you like to revise your sworn statements at this time?" Both officers, who had been trying to blend into the courtroom's woodwork, were now edging slowly toward the exit, their faces pale with terror. "And here," Evelyn said, advancing the video to show the assault from Miller's own first-person perspective, "we can see the precise moment when Officer Frank Miller committed felony assault against a federal judge." She let those words hang in the air for a long moment. A federal judge. Miller's knees finally buckled. He collapsed onto the prosecutor's table, grabbing it to keep from falling to the floor. "But wait," Evelyn said, her voice taking on an almost conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than her anger. "There's more." She pulled up a new file on her tablet. "This is audio from Officer Riley's body cam, which was apparently functioning perfectly this morning." A new voice filled the courtroom, Riley's, speaking to Jennings while Miller was assaulting Evelyn. "Dude, Miller's really going off on this one. You think she's actually somebody important like she keeps trying to say?" Jennings's voice responded, filled with casual cruelty. "Nah, man. Look at her. Miller knows what he's doing. Probably just another welfare queen trying to scam the system." The audio captured the sound of their laughter as they watched their colleague brutalize a federal judge. The few remaining spectators in the gallery were staring at Miller with raw, undisguised revulsion. "Officer Miller," Evelyn said, setting down her tablet with a soft click. "You asked me earlier if I had any employment verification. Well, I do." She gestured to the large, official judicial seal mounted on the wall behind her bench, then to the polished brass nameplate on the front of the bench, then to the formal, oil-painted portrait of herself that hung in the courthouse lobby. "I have been the presiding judge of this courthouse for 23 years, Officer Miller. Every case you've ever testified in, every warrant you've ever requested, every search you've ever conducted in this jurisdiction has been under my authority." Miller finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled, pathetic whisper. "Your Honor, I didn't know." "You didn't know," Evelyn repeated slowly, letting the pathetic excuse hang in the air before dissecting it. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to look. You saw a black woman, and you made a cascade of vile assumptions. You saw someone you thought was powerless, and you decided to indulge your ugliest impulses and abuse that power." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto his. "But Officer Miller, there's something else you didn't know." The courtroom held its breath. "For the past 6 months, I have been personally overseeing a joint investigation with the FBI's Civil Rights Division into patterns of misconduct, racial bias, and corruption in your police department." Miller's face went completely white, a bloodless mask of pure terror. "This morning's incident wasn't random, Officer Miller. You've been under federal investigation, and you just provided us with the most perfect, pristine, undeniable evidence we could have ever hoped for." She lifted her heavy gavel, holding it in front of her. "Officer Miller, you said actions have consequences. You were right about that." The gavel came down with a sound like a clap of thunder. "Court will recess while I consider the appropriate criminal charges to be filed against you and your partners." As the bailiff moved to take a stunned, catatonic Miller into custody, he finally understood. He hadn't just assaulted a random woman. He had assaulted justice itself. And justice was about to hit back with the force of a hurricane. When court resumed 20 minutes later, the atmosphere had been completely transformed. Word of the morning's events had spread through the courthouse like wildfire. The gallery was now packed to capacity. Lawyers, clerks, bailiffs from other courtrooms, and court reporters had quietly filed in, drawn by whispers of the most spectacular, jaw-dropping courtroom reversal in the building's long history. Miller sat slumped in what was now undeniably the defendant's chair. His uniform was wrinkled, his face ashen. His hastily summoned attorney, a nervous public defender named Michael Carter, kept shooting worried, pitying glances at his client, who seemed to be in a state of shock. Judge Evelyn Reed returned to her bench with the same measured dignity she had displayed thousands of times before. But now every eye in the room saw her differently. This wasn't just any judge. This was the woman who had been brutally assaulted by the man now trembling before her, the woman who had turned the tables on her attacker with breathtaking legal precision. "Officer Miller," she began, her voice resonating with the full weight of her 23 years of judicial authority. "Before we proceed with the very serious criminal charges you now face, I believe this court, and everyone present, deserves to understand exactly who you assaulted this morning." She stood, moving from behind the bench to address the packed courtroom directly, as if speaking to the entire community. "My name is Judge Evelyn Reed. I have served as the presiding judge of this courthouse for 23 years. I was appointed to this position by Governor Richardson in 2002, and I was confirmed by the state Senate with a unanimous vote." Her voice grew stronger, each word a hammer blow against Miller's lies. "I graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, where I was the editor of the Harvard Law Review. Before my appointment to the bench, I served for 8 years as a federal prosecutor in the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice." Miller's attorney was scribbling frantically on a legal pad, likely trying to calculate the sheer number of decades his client was about to face in federal prison. "During my tenure as a federal prosecutor, I specialized in cases involving police misconduct, civil rights violations, and institutional racism. I successfully prosecuted 47 cases against law enforcement officers who abused their authority and violated their oath of office." She paused, letting that number sink into the silent room. "In my 23 years on this bench, I have presided over more than 15,000 cases. I have sentenced hundreds of defendants, from petty thieves to murderers. I have seen every type of criminal behavior, every excuse, every justification." Judge Reed walked closer to where Miller sat cowering, a broken man in a wrinkled uniform. "But in all my years of service, Officer Miller, I have never, not once, encountered such a perfect, textbook example of everything that is wrong with policing in America." The packed courtroom was so still, the only sound was Miller's ragged, labored breathing. "You see, Officer Miller, when you called me ghetto trash and garbage, when you told me I belonged in a cage, when you slammed me against the wall of my own courthouse, you weren't just assaulting a random citizen." She returned to her position behind the bench, a figure of immense power and moral authority. "You were assaulting the one person who has dedicated her entire career to ensuring that officers precisely like you are held accountable for their actions." Judge Reed opened a thick file that had been placed on her bench during the recess. "This file contains detailed records of every case you've testified in over the past 5 years. 43 cases, Officer Miller. 43 times you have stood in my courtroom, placed your hand on a Bible, and sworn to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." She flipped through several pages. "Of those cases, 28 involved defendants who were people of color. In 26 of those cases, you were the sole arresting officer. And in every single one, Officer Miller, your police reports describe the defendants using remarkably similar language to what you used with me this morning. Her voice was a low, dangerous monotone, acting erratically, refusing to comply, becoming aggressive, threatening officer safety. The same words, the same narrative, the same lies over and over and over again. Judge Reed closed the file with a sharp, definitive snap. But here's what you didn't know, Officer Miller. For the past 6 months, as I mentioned, I have been working with the FBI's Civil Rights Division, the State Attorney General's Office, and the Department of Justice to investigate systemic patterns of racial bias and misconduct in your police department. The public defender stopped writing and simply stared at his client with an expression of profound pity. Your name, Officer Miller, appears on a federal watch list. You have been under surveillance. Your communications have been monitored. Your arrest patterns have been analyzed. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes boring into him. And this morning, Officer Miller, you provided us with the most perfect, unambiguous, undeniable evidence of criminal civil rights violations that any prosecutor could ever hope for. Judge Reed lifted her gavel. You assaulted a federal judge while she was performing her official duties. You did so based explicitly on racial animus, as evidenced by your own recorded statements. You then committed perjury when you lied, repeatedly and with conviction, under oath about the circumstances of that assault. The gavel hovered in the air like a guillotine. Officer Miller, you asked me this morning if I knew my place. Well, let me tell you exactly what my place is. Her voice filled the courtroom, clear and unwavering. My place is on this bench, in this courtroom, ensuring that justice is served. My place is holding people like you accountable when you abuse the sacred power we, the people, have entrusted to you. The gavel came down once, a sharp crack of judgment. My place, Officer Miller, is making sure that what you did to me this morning is the very last act of racial violence you will ever commit as a police officer. Judge Reed stood behind her bench, her judicial robes flowing around her like armor forged from justice itself. The packed courtroom held its collective breath as she prepared to deliver what everyone knew would be a historic verdict. Officer Miller, she began, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of jurisprudence. Before I render judgment in this matter, I want to address not just you, but everyone in this courtroom and everyone who will hear about what happened here today. She gestured to the gallery, packed with lawyers, court staff, reporters, and citizens. This morning began with a simple question. What happens when someone with a badge and a gun believes they are above the law? What happens when years of unchecked power, departmental protection, and systemic indifference create a person who thinks they can assault a federal judge on the steps of her own courthouse and face no consequences? Miller sat slumped in his chair, his life and career crumbling around him in real time. The answer, Officer Miller, Judge Reed declared, is standing before you right now. She picked up her gavel, the same one engraved with the words, Solum veritatem spectat. It beholds the truth alone. For 15 years, you have terrorized this community. For 15 years, you have violated the constitutional rights of citizens whose only crime was existing while black or brown. For 15 years, you have made a mockery of the badge you were sworn to honor. Her voice grew stronger, more passionate. But your greatest mistake, Officer Miller, wasn't any single act of brutality. Your greatest mistake was believing that the system would always protect you, no matter how far you went, no matter how many lives you destroyed. Miller finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and utterly defeated. This morning, when you called me a filthy animal and told me I belonged in a cage, when you slammed me against the wall of my own courthouse, when you handcuffed me and paraded me through these halls like a criminal, you thought you were asserting your dominance over just another powerless victim. Judge Reed leaned forward, her voice dropping to just above a whisper, forcing everyone to strain to hear her powerful words. "But I was never powerless, Officer Miller, and neither were any of the hundreds of people you've brutalized over the years. The only difference is that today, justice finally had a witness who could not be ignored." She straightened to her full height. "Officer Miller, based on the incontrovertible evidence presented in this courtroom, evidence that came from your own mouth, your own actions, and your own camera, I find you guilty of assault in the first degree, a felony." The words hit the courtroom like thunder. "I find you guilty of assault on a judicial officer, a federal felony carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years. Miller's attorney closed his eyes and put his head in his hands. "I find you guilty of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, a federal felony punishable by up to 10 years in prison. Witao andamar." With each pronouncement, Miller seemed to shrink further into his chair, becoming smaller and smaller. "And I find you guilty of perjury in the first degree for the false testimony you delivered under oath in this very courtroom." Judge Reed paused, letting the crushing weight of those charges settle over the room. "But, Officer Miller, this case was never really just about you. You are simply a symptom of a much larger disease, a cancer that has infected our justice system for far too long." She turned to address the packed gallery. "For too long, we have allowed police officers to operate with impunity. For too long, we have dismissed complaints, ignored evidence, and paid out millions in settlements while allowing the abuse to continue unabated. For too long, we have told the victims of police brutality that their experiences don't matter, that their word doesn't count, that justice simply isn't for them." Her voice rose with righteous passion. "But that ends today. In this courtroom, what happened here today proves that no one is above the law. Not police officers, not prosecutors, not even judges. No one." Miller suddenly broke down completely, his body shaking with deep, gut-wrenching sobs that echoed through the silent courtroom. "I'm sorry," he whispered, a pathetic, broken sound. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I never meant—" Judge Reed looked down at him, not with contempt, but with a profound, weary sadness. "Officer Miller, your apology is 15 years and 47 formal complaints too late. Your remorse is only appearing now because you finally got caught by someone with the power to hold you accountable." She lifted her gavel high above her head. "But here is what I want you to understand in your final moments as a free man. Every single person you brutalized over the years deserved the exact same justice I am delivering today. Every grandmother you called a slur, every teenager you planted drugs on, every doctor you arrested for daring to live in the wrong neighborhood, they all deserved to see you held accountable." The gavel hovered in the air. "Today, I am not just delivering justice for myself. I am delivering justice for every person whose complaints were dismissed as unsubstantiated. I am delivering justice for every family who had to watch their loved one be brutalized while the system simply looked the other way." Her voice filled every corner of the courtroom. "Officer Miller, you told me this morning to know my place. Well, let me tell you what my place is. My place is ensuring that bullies like you can never again hide behind a badge while destroying innocent lives." The gavel came down with a sound like the crack of thunder. "Officer Miller, you are hereby sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed by law. You will serve 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." Miller collapsed completely, his sobs now uncontrollable. "Furthermore," Judge Williams continued, "I am ordering a full, independent federal investigation into every case you have touched, every arrest you have made, and every complaint that has ever been filed against you. The victims you have silenced for 15 years will finally have their day in court." She set down her gavel and looked out over the packed courtroom. Let this be a message to every police officer, every prosecutor, every official who thinks they can abuse their power without consequences. Justice may be blind, but she sees everything, and eventually she comes for everyone. 6 months later, the ripple effects of that historic morning continued to transform the entire justice system. Officer Miller was serving the first year of his 25-year sentence in federal prison. His badge, his pension, his freedom, all gone. The man who once terrorized a community now lived in protective custody, finally understanding what it felt like to be powerless. But Miller's downfall was just the beginning. The federal investigation Judge Reed ordered uncovered a web of corruption that reached deep into the police department's command structure. 12 other officers were terminated for misconduct. 4 supervisors were criminally charged with obstruction and conspiracy. The entire department was placed under a federal consent decree, forcing systemic reform from the top down. Most importantly, the 432 cases that Miller had tainted were reopened. Dozens of wrongfully convicted defendants were released from prison, their faces etched with the tears of long-delayed vindication. Hundreds more had their charges dropped or their sentences reduced. The county paid out an additional $8 $7 million in compensation to Miller's victims, money that came directly from the police department's budget, forcing a painful but necessary reckoning. Judge Reed herself became a national symbol of judicial integrity and courage. She was invited to speak at law schools across the country, sharing the story of how one moment of violence revealed decades of systemic abuse. Her message was always the same: justice delayed is justice denied, but justice finally delivered is a victory for all. The courthouse where it all happened was officially renamed the Justice Evelyn Reed Federal Courthouse in her honor. A bronze plaque near the entrance now commemorates the morning that changed everything, with a simple inscription: "Here, justice finally found its voice." The young law clerk, Sarah, inspired by Judge Reed's courage, turned down a lucrative corporate job and now works for the ACLU, fighting similar battles in courtrooms across the nation. Officers Jennings and Riley, who had supported Miller's lies, were terminated and faced their own federal charges. Their recorded laughter while watching a federal judge be brutalized became required viewing in police academies nationwide, a case study in institutional corruption and the failure of the blue wall of silence. The video of Judge Reed delivering her verdict became one of the most watched pieces of courtroom footage in Internet history, viewed over 50 million times. Comments poured in from around the world from people who had experienced similar injustices but had never seen accountability delivered so completely, so publicly, so perfectly. Never underestimate the power of one person to demand justice. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to see that courage can triumph over corruption. Hit that like button to show your support for true accountability. And make sure you subscribe, because stories like this happen every day, and the world needs to see them. What was the most powerful moment for you? Let's talk about it in the comments. Because sometimes justice doesn't just wear a blindfold. Sometimes justice wears judicial robes. And sometimes, when the moment is right, justice hits back.